I found the old canteen half buried in the dirt while setting up our campsite, its dented metal surface still bearing the faint outline of a military insignia I did not recognize. When I wiped away the mud, I noticed something strange. The canteen was warm to the touch, impossibly warm, as if someone had just been holding it moments before. But we were miles from any trail, deep in a part of the Virginia wilderness where no one had camped in decades. I looked around at the empty forest, at the dying light filtering through the trees, and felt the first whisper of something wrong settle into my bones. That is when I heard it, the distant sound of marching boots, rhythmic and steady, coming from a direction where there was no path. My name is Austin, and I am 27 years old. What I am about to tell you happened 3 months ago in the Shenandoah Valley, though it feels like a lifetime has passed since that night. I work as a historical researcher for the National Park Service, specializing in Civil War battlefields and forgotten military sites. My job takes me to remote locations across the country, documenting unmarked graves, old encampments, and the remnants of battles that history has largely forgotten. I have always believed in facts, in what can be proven and documented. I have walked 100 battlefields and never felt anything but sadness for the lives lost there. But what happened in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about death, duty, and the things that keep soldiers fighting long after the war has ended. Before I continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something you could not explain? Something that made you question what you thought was real? Leave your stories in the comments below. I read every single one, and after what I went through, I have learned that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the truest ones. It started with a routine assignment. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia who had been with the Park Service for 30 years, called me into her office on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air outside was crisp with autumn, and the trees lining the parking lot were ablaze with red and gold. Inside her office, though, the atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive. Patricia sat behind her desk with her hands folded in front of her, and I noticed immediately that something was troubling her. In all the years I had worked under her supervision, I had never seen her look quite so unsettled. She slid a folder across her desk toward me, its contents thin and unremarkable. The folder itself was old, the manila surface stained and worn at the edges, as if it had been handled many times over many years. "There is a site I need you to investigate," she said, her voice carrying a hesitation I had never heard from her before. "It is about 40 miles northwest of Front Royal, deep in the valley. We received a letter from a local historian claiming there is an unmarked burial site there, possibly from the Civil War. Could be Union, could be Confederate. He did not have many details." I opened the folder and found a single handwritten letter, the paper yellowed and the ink slightly faded. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone very old or very frightened. The letter spoke of a clearing in the woods where local hunters refused to go, where compasses spun uselessly and animals fell silent. The writer, who signed his name only as J. Whitmore, claimed that his grandfather had told him stories about a battalion that had vanished during the war, never recorded in any official records, never mourned or remembered. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier, and as I read through it, I noticed that Whitmore's handwriting became increasingly erratic toward the end, the letters large and pressed hard into the paper, as if he had been writing with great urgency or emotion. "This sounds like folklore," I said, looking up at Patricia. "We get dozens of letters like this every year. Most of them lead nowhere. Local legends about ghost soldiers and haunted battlefields. They are almost never based on historical fact." Patricia nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out 2 more letters, both in the same handwriting, both showing that same progression from neat script to frantic scrawling. "I know, but there is something about this one that bothers me. Whitmore sent 3 letters over the past 5 years, each one more insistent than the last. The final one arrived 2 weeks ago." She paused, choosing her words carefully. He died 4 days after mailing it. Heart attack, according to the local coroner. He was 83 years old. I felt a chill run down my spine, though I told myself it meant nothing. People died every day, especially elderly people. It was a coincidence, nothing more. But as I looked at the 3 letters spread across Patricia's desk, I could not shake the feeling that there was something desperately urgent about them, as if Whitmore had been racing against time to tell someone, anyone, about what he knew. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Go to the site, document what you find. If there are graves there, we need to know about it. If it is just local legend, we can close the file and move on." Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Take your equipment, plan for 3 days in the field. And Austin," she waited until I met her eyes, "be careful. That area has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" "The kind that keeps locals away after dark. The kind that makes grown men refuse to hunt there, even during deer season when the woods should be full of hunters. I made some calls to the Forest Service, asked about that area. Every ranger I spoke to had heard stories. Different stories, mind you, but all of them agreed on one thing. There is something wrong with that clearing. People who camp there report nightmares, equipment failures, a feeling of being watched. One ranger told me that search and rescue dogs refuse to enter the area. They will track a scent right up to the edge of that clearing, and then stop, whining and pulling backward, no matter how much their handlers try to get them to continue. I looked down at the letters again, at Whitmore's increasingly desperate handwriting. "Did you know him, Whitmore?" "No, but I called the local historical society after he died. They knew him, said he was a respected local historian, very rational, not given to flights of fancy. He taught history at the high school for 40 years before he retired. The woman I spoke to said that whatever Whitmore believed about that clearing, he believed it absolutely. She also said he had become obsessed with it in his final years, that he talked about it constantly, said he felt responsible for telling someone official about it before he died." "Responsible how?" Patricia shook her head. She did not know, but she said Whitmore claimed his grandfather had made him promise to pass the information on, that it was a family duty spanning generations. His grandfather was apparently a local guide during the Civil War, hired by both Union and Confederate forces at different times to help them navigate the valley. According to the Historical Society, the grandfather supposedly knew about a battle that was never recorded, a fight that happened in secret and was deliberately covered up by both sides. Why would both sides cover up a battle? That is what you are going to find out, or you are going to prove it is all just an old man's fantasy. Either way, we need to know." I left her office with the folder under my arm and a growing sense of unease that I could not quite explain. I told myself I was being foolish, letting an old woman's superstitions affect my judgment. But as I prepared my equipment that afternoon, loading my truck with camping gear, surveying tools, and documentation equipment, I could not shake the feeling that I was preparing for something more than a routine field assignment. I spent the rest of that day and most of the next morning gathering supplies and reviewing maps of the area. The coordinates Whitmore had provided in his letter pointed to a section of the Shenandoah Valley that was technically part of the George Washington National Forest, but was so remote and rugged that it saw almost no visitors. The nearest trail was 5 miles away, and the terrain between the trail and the clearing was steep and difficult, with no water sources and dense underbrush that would make hiking exhausting. I loaded my truck with more supplies than I normally would for a 3-day trip. Something about this assignment made me want to be overprepared. I packed extra batteries for all my equipment, 2 GPS units instead of 1, 3 different compasses, a satellite phone in case my cell phone did not work, and enough food and water for 5 days instead of 3. I also packed my grandfather's old army compass, a Korean War relic that he had given me before he died. It was not as precise as my modern equipment, but it had sentimental value, and for some reason I felt better having it with me. I left early the next morning, driving through the pre-dawn darkness as fog rolled through the valleys like a living thing. The forecast had called for clear weather, but as I drove deeper into the mountains, the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. I had to slow to a crawl on the narrow mountain roads, my headlights reflecting off the white wall of mist in front of me. The GPS coordinates Whitmore had provided in his letter led me far off the main highways, onto county roads that became dirt tracks, and finally to a fire road so overgrown I had to get out twice to move fallen branches. By the time I reached the end of the navigable road, it was nearly noon, and I was at least 5 miles from the nearest paved surface. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, studying the forest in front of me. The fog had lifted somewhat, but the woods still looked dark and uninviting. The trees here were massive, old-growth forests that had somehow escaped logging, and their branches created a canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The underbrush was dense, a tangle of mountain laurel and rhododendron that would make hiking difficult. I checked my equipment one more time, shouldered my pack, and began hiking deeper into the forest. The terrain was rough, all steep hillsides and dense underbrush that clutched at my legs with every step. The trees here were old, massive oaks and chestnuts that had probably stood since before the Civil War, their branches creating a canopy so thick that the forest floor existed in a perpetual twilight. I checked my compass regularly, following the coordinates Whitmore had provided, but something felt off from the very beginning. The needle seemed sluggish, slow to respond, and more than once I had to stop and reorient myself. The forest was unusually quiet. I had hiked in hundreds of forests across the country, and they were always full of sound. Birds calling, squirrels rustling in the leaves, insects buzzing, the distant sound of running water. But here, the silence was profound and unsettling. The only sounds were my own, my breathing, my footsteps, the rustle of my pack against my jacket. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After 2 hours of hiking, I stopped to rest and check my position. According to my GPS, I was still 2 miles from the coordinates Whitmore had given. I pulled out my water bottle and sat on a fallen log, studying the forest around me. The trees here were twisted, their trunks bent at odd angles, and many of them bore old scars, places where the bark had been stripped away decades ago and never fully healed. I stood up and examined one of the scarred trees more closely. The damage was too uniform to be natural, too deliberate. It looked almost like something had clawed at the tree, gouging deep furrows into the wood. I took several photographs of the scarred trees, noting their GPS coordinates in my field notebook. This was the kind of anomaly that might indicate historical human activity in the area. Perhaps soldiers had camped here and damaged the trees while gathering firewood or building fortifications. I continued hiking, and as I got closer to the coordinates, the forest began to change in subtle ways. The underbrush thinned out, making walking easier, but the trees grew more twisted and scarred. The silence deepened, and the temperature began to drop slowly at first, then more noticeably. I had started my hike in comfortable 65-degree weather, but now I was reaching for my jacket, watching my breath mist in the air. I checked my thermometer, 53 degrees. A 12-degree drop in temperature over the course of 2 miles. It was possible, especially in mountain terrain where cold air could settle in valleys, but it felt wrong. The temperature drop was too uniform, too steady, as if I was walking into a freezer rather than through a natural landscape. After 3 hours of hiking, I found the clearing. It was not what I expected. Most forgotten battlefields have some remnant of their history. A rusted cannonball, deteriorating earthworks, the telltale depressions in the ground that mark old trenches. This clearing had none of that, at least not at first glance. It was roughly circular, about 100 yards across, and the grass grew in strange patterns, spiraling inward toward the center like water circling a drain. The trees surrounding it stood at odd angles, all leaning slightly away from the clearing, as if they had spent years trying to escape. The silence was absolute. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to die as it reached the edge of the clearing, leaving the air unnaturally still. I stood at the tree line for several minutes, studying the space before me. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to hike back to my truck and tell Patricia there was nothing here. It was the same feeling I had experienced once before, years ago, when I had been hiking alone in the Rockies and had come face to face with a mountain lion. My body recognized danger even when my mind could not articulate what that danger was. But I was a professional. I had a job to do. I took a deep breath, pulled out my camera, and took several photographs of the clearing from the tree line. Then I stepped forward, crossing the invisible boundary between the forest and the clearing. The temperature dropped immediately, a plunge of at least 20 degrees that made my breath visible in the air and sent a shock of cold through my entire body. I stopped, startled, and looked back at the forest behind me. The afternoon sun was still shining through the trees, warm and golden, but here in the clearing, it felt like winter. I could see the difference at the tree line, see where the warm air ended and the cold air began, a visible distortion in the air like heat shimmer in reverse. I pulled out my thermometer and took a reading, 42 degrees. I stepped back across the threshold into the forest, 71 degrees. Back into the clearing, 43 degrees. Impossible. Temperature did not change like that. There had to be a logical explanation. An underground spring, unusual air currents, some kind of microclimate created by the geography of the area. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my hands were shaking as I recorded the readings in my notebook. I forced myself to move deeper into the clearing, taking measurements and observations every few steps. The cold intensified as I moved toward the center, dropping to 38 degrees at the exact middle of the clearing. The grass here was brown and dead, despite the fact that it was only October and the grass at the edges of the clearing was still green. I knelt down and examined the dead grass more closely. It was brittle and frost-covered, as if it had been frozen solid. But it was 68 degrees outside the clearing. This should not be possible. I spent the next 2 hours conducting a preliminary survey of the clearing. I used ground-penetrating radar to scan for graves or buried artifacts, but the equipment kept malfunctioning, displaying error messages I had never seen before. The screen would show normal readings for a moment, then dissolve into static, then show what looked like dozens of large metallic objects buried just beneath the surface, then go back to static. I tried resetting the equipment 3 times, but the results were the same: intermittent, unreliable, displaying impossible readings. My camera worked, but every photo I took came out strangely blurred, as if something was interfering with the lens. Not completely obscured, but distorted, with strange light artifacts and shadows that should not have been there given the position of the sun. My compass was useless here. The needle spun slowly in endless circles, never settling on a direction. Even my GPS was having problems, showing my position jumping around randomly within a 100-yard radius, as if I was simultaneously in multiple locations at once. I pulled out my grandfather's old compass, the Korean War relic I had packed on impulse. To my surprise, it worked perfectly, the needle pointing steadily north with no hesitation or spinning. I stared at it for a long moment, wondering why an old mechanical compass would work when my modern equipment failed, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. As the afternoon wore into evening, I began finding artifacts. They were scattered around the clearing with no apparent pattern. A belt buckle, Union Army issue, dated 1863. A bayonet so rusted it crumbled when I tried to pick it up. Uniform buttons, both Union and Confederate, lying side by side. A broken pocket watch, its hands frozen at 4:47. And everywhere spent bullet casings, hundreds of them, half buried in the soil as if the earth itself was slowly consuming them. I collected samples of each type of artifact, carefully documenting their positions with my notebook and camera since my GPS was unreliable. The mixture of Union and Confederate artifacts was strange. This area had changed hands several times during the Civil War, so it was possible that both sides had fought here. But usually when that happened, the artifacts were separated, concentrated in different areas of the battlefield based on where each side had positioned their troops. Here, they were mixed together, Union and Confederate items lying next to each other as if the soldiers had been fighting hand to hand, intermingled rather than in formation. But there were no bones, no graves, no indication that anyone had actually died here, despite the evidence of battle all around me. As I worked, I began to notice other strange details. The trees at the edge of the clearing were not just leaning away from the center, they were dead on the side facing the clearing, their bark blackened and peeling, while the side facing away from the clearing was healthy and green. It looked like they had been burned, but there was no evidence of fire, no charred wood or ash. Just dead, blackened bark that flaked away at the slightest touch. I also found what looked like trenches or earthworks, but they were wrong. Most Civil War trenches were dug in straight lines or zigzags, designed to provide cover while allowing soldiers to shoot at the enemy. These trenches were circular, concentric rings that spiraled inward toward the center of the clearing, as if soldiers had been trying to defend against an enemy that could attack from any direction at once. The whole clearing felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. It was not just the cold or the malfunctioning equipment or the strange artifacts. It was something deeper, more fundamental. The clearing felt like a wound in the world, a place where something terrible had happened and had never healed, festering and spreading its corruption to everything around it. I was so focused on my work that I did not realize how late it had gotten until I looked up and saw that the sun was setting. The forest had grown dark, shadows stretching long across the clearing, and I had a decision to make. Hike back to my truck in the dark or set up camp here and continue my survey in the morning. Every rational part of my brain told me to leave. Hiking in the dark was dangerous, yes, but staying here felt more dangerous in a way I could not explain. But I was exhausted, and the hike back was long and treacherous. More importantly, I was starting to believe there was something here worth documenting, something that could not be explained by conventional history. I decided to stay. I set up my tent at the edge of the clearing, close enough to the tree line that I could retreat into the forest if necessary, though I could not have said what I thought I might need to retreat from. As I worked, the darkness deepened and I began to feel watched. It was not a subtle sensation. It was visceral, overwhelming, the absolute certainty that something was observing me from the shadows between the trees. I told myself it was just nerves, just the isolation and the strange atmosphere of the place getting into my head. I have camped alone in remote locations dozens of times. I am not easily frightened. But as I started a fire and prepared a simple meal, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness for movement. The fire helped. The warm light pushed back the oppressive darkness, and the crackling flames provided a comforting sound in the suffocating silence. I sat close to the fire, eating my dinner without really tasting it, trying to convince myself that I was being irrational. That is when I found the canteen. I had decided to gather more firewood before it got completely dark, reasoning that I would want enough to keep the fire burning through the night. I walked just beyond the edge of my campsite, using my flashlight to scan the ground for fallen branches, when I saw something metallic glinting in the beam of light. The canteen was partially buried, just the top edge visible above the dirt. I knelt down and pulled it free, and the moment my fingers touched it, I felt that impossible warmth. In the cold of the clearing, the canteen felt like it had been sitting in the sun, warm and almost alive. I carried it back to my fire and examined it more closely. It was old, very old, the metal dented and corroded but still intact. In the firelight, I could make out the insignia more clearly, a shield with the number 28 and what looked like a bird of prey, possibly an eagle, above it. Below the shield were letters, too worn to read fully, but I could make out what looked like Anton, Al, and Ejim. I did not recognize it from any Civil War regiment I had studied. The style looked older, more consistent with Revolutionary War or early Federal period military equipment. But that did not make sense. This was a Civil War battlefield. At least, that is what Whitmore's letters had claimed. Why would there be Revolutionary War artifacts here? I was turning it over in my hands, examining it more closely, when I heard the sound. Footsteps, multiple sets of them, marching in formation. The sound came from the north side of the clearing, rhythmic and steady. Left, right, right. The steady cadence of soldiers on the march, boots hitting the ground in perfect unison. I stood up slowly, the canteen still in my hand, and stared into the darkness. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by other sounds. The jingle of equipment, the creak of leather, the low murmur of voices too distant to understand. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the vast darkness. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. It was absolute, suffocating, like the entire world was holding its breath. I stood frozen by my fire, every muscle tensed, waiting. Then I saw them. They emerged from the tree line like smoke, translucent and flickering in the firelight. Soldiers, dozens of them. They wore uniforms from different eras, different wars. Union blue and Confederate gray, yes, but also uniforms I did not immediately recognize, older styles from wars I would need to research to identify. Some wore the blue coat and white breeches of Revolutionary War soldiers. Others wore uniforms that looked even older, styles I had only seen in history books. They moved in formation, their faces blank and staring, their mouths moving as if they were speaking, but no sound reached my ears. Their eyes looked straight ahead, seeing nothing, focused on something I could not perceive. They marched across the clearing, and I realized with a sick jolt of horror that they were not walking on the ground. They were moving several inches above it, their feet never quite touching the earth, as if they were treading on a surface that no longer existed. I stumbled backward, away from the fire, away from the impossible sight before me. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My scientific training was screaming at me that this could not be real, that I must be hallucinating, that there had to be a rational explanation. But I could not look away. The soldiers were real. They were there. I could see them. Now, if you are watching this and finding it hard to believe, I do not blame you. I am a researcher, a skeptic by nature and by training. If someone had told me this story before I experienced it myself, I would have dismissed it as fantasy or mental illness. But what I saw that night was real. And if you have ever experienced something that defied explanation, something that made you question everything you thought you knew, then hit that subscribe button and join this community. We need to talk about these things. We need to share our experiences, because the world is stranger and more terrible than we have been taught to believe. The soldiers paid me no attention. They marched in formation across the clearing toward the eastern tree line, and as they moved, more details became visible. Some carried muskets. Others carried rifles from later periods. A few had modern weapons, assault rifles that would not be invented for another century after the Civil War ended. Their uniforms were torn and bloodstained, and many of them bore horrific wounds. Gaping chest cavities where bullets or bayonets had penetrated, missing limbs that ended in ragged stumps, heads caved in by blunt trauma or shattered by bullets. They were dead. They had all been dead for a very long time, but they were still marching, still following orders that no living officer had given them in generations. The formation reached the far side of the clearing and stopped. A figure emerged from their ranks, taller than the others, his uniform less distinct, as if he was made of older shadows, darkness given form and purpose. He raised one arm and the battalion turned as one, facing back toward the west. Toward where I stood. The tall figure's head turned slowly, scanning the clearing, and for one terrible moment, His eyes met mine. They were empty, void of all humanity, and looking into them was like looking into an abyss that went on forever. I felt something cold and invasive probe at my mind, assessing me, trying to determine what I was and whether I belonged here. Then his gaze moved on, dismissing me as irrelevant, and I could breathe again. That is when I heard the other sound, coming from the opposite direction, from the western edge of the clearing. Another battalion marching in from the west. These soldiers were more solid, more clearly defined, and I could hear them. The pound of their boots, the ragged sound of their breathing, the creak of leather and metal, commands shouted in voices rough with exhaustion. The two groups were going to meet in the middle of the clearing. They were going to fight. And I was standing exactly where they would meet. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I sprinted for the tree line, abandoning my pack and my equipment, caring only about putting distance between myself and whatever was about to happen. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, I heard the first gunshots, sharp cracks that echoed through the forest like thunder, each one a physical blow against my eardrums. Then more shots, a whole volley of them, followed by screaming, the clash of metal on metal, and underneath it all, a sound like static, like the world itself was tearing apart at the seams. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were going to give out. I did not care. Terror drove me forward, pure animal panic that overrode every other consideration. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, my legs burning, I turned to look back at the clearing. The entire area was lit up as if it were daylight, though the sky above was still full of stars. The light had no apparent source. It simply existed, a harsh white glare that illuminated every detail of the clearing with unnatural clarity. Figures moved through the light, fighting, dying, falling, and rising again to continue fighting. Muzzle flashes sparked in the darkness like fireflies. Smoke billowed up from the clearing, thick and choking. But when it reached the tree line, it simply vanished, as if it could not exist beyond the boundaries of that cursed ground. I wanted to keep running. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. But something held me there. Maybe it was professional curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper, a sense that I was witnessing something important, something that needed to be documented and understood. Or maybe I was just in shock, my mind unable to process what was happening, defaulting to observer mode because that was what I had been trained to do. I pulled out my phone and tried to record what was happening, but the screen was glitching, showing only fragments of corrupted video interspersed with bursts of static before shutting down completely. My camera was back at the campsite. All I had were my eyes and my memory. So I watched. The battle raged with an intensity that seemed impossible for men who were already dead. The two battalions collided in the center of the clearing with a crash I could feel in my bones. Bayonets pierced ethereal flesh. Rifles fired point-blank into ghostly faces. Swords clashed with impacts that sent sparks flying into the night air. But this was not a normal battle. As I watched, I began to notice patterns. The same movements repeated themselves. A soldier would fire his musket, fall backward as if struck, lie still for exactly 7 seconds, then rise and fire again at the exact same angle. Another soldier would charge forward with his bayonet, thrust at an enemy who would dodge to the left, then both would reset and repeat the sequence. They were caught in a loop, acting out the same battle over and over, forever locked into their final moments. But not all of them were locked into the same moment. That was what made it so terrible. Some of the soldiers were from the Civil War, fighting battles from 1861 to 1865. Others were from earlier conflicts, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, even what looked like colonial militia from before the Revolution. They were all fighting each other in a confused melee, where a musket-wielding Revolutionary War soldier might fire at a Union infantryman, who would then turn and shoot at a Confederate cavalryman, who would charge at a militiaman from a different century entirely. It was chaos, pure, nightmarish chaos, a distillation of every battle that had ever been fought in this clearing, all happening simultaneously, all the participants forever locked into their final moments of combat. I watched for hours, unable to look away despite the horror of what I was seeing. Around 1:00 a.m., I noticed something new. The fighting was becoming more focused. The soldiers were starting to organize themselves, not by the sides they had originally fought for, but by when they had died. The Revolutionary War soldiers formed one group, the War of 1812 soldiers another. The Civil War soldiers divided themselves into Union and Confederate, but they were fighting together against the older soldiers as often as they were fighting each other. It was as if they were trying to figure out what was happening, trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense. They were dead, but they did not know it. They were fighting, but they did not know why. They were trapped, but they did not know how to escape. Around 3:00 a.m., the intensity of the fighting began to increase. The soldiers moved faster, fought more desperately, as if they knew time was running out. And I realized they were trying to finish the battle. They were trying to reach some kind of resolution before sunrise, before the night ended and they were pulled back into whatever darkness held them during the day. But they could not finish. The battle had no end, no resolution. It just continued, an endless cycle of violence and death and resurrection, over and over forever. I crept closer to the clearing, staying hidden in the trees but moving near enough that I could see details. The tall figure I had noticed earlier, the one who seemed to command the Eastern Battalion, was engaged in combat with another officer from the Western group. They fought with swords, their blades meeting with impacts that I could feel in my chest even from a distance, each clash sending out a shock wave that made the air shimmer. Both men bore wounds that should have killed them instantly. The Eastern officer had a bayonet protruding from his stomach, the blade thrust completely through his body and emerging from his back. The Western officer was missing half his face, the flesh torn away to reveal bone and teeth, one eye socket empty and dark. But they fought on, neither willing to concede, neither able to die because they were already dead. The Eastern officer was taller, his movements more fluid and practiced, suggesting formal military training. The Western officer was stockier, his fighting style rougher and more aggressive, all raw power and determination. They had probably been fighting each other for more than 2 centuries, this same duel over and over, neither ever winning, neither ever losing. That is when I understood. These men were not fighting because they were cursed or because they were evil. They were fighting because they did not know how to stop. They had died in battle in the middle of combat, with their duty unfulfilled and their orders not yet carried out. And so they continued fighting, night after night, century after century, trying to complete a mission that had been obsolete before most of them were even born. The thought filled me with a sadness so profound I felt tears running down my face. These were not monsters. They were soldiers. Men who had believed in something enough to die for it, who had given everything in service to a cause they thought was just. They deserved rest. They deserved peace. They deserved to lay down their weapons and know that their sacrifice had mattered, that they had done enough, that they could finally stop. But something was keeping them here, trapped in their final moments, unable to move on. And as I watched them fight with desperate, futile determination, I knew I had to help them. I did not know how, but I knew I had to try. I waited until there was a lull in the fighting, a brief moment when the 2 battalions pulled back to regroup. The soldiers stood in their formations, chests heaving with exertion they did not need, weapons ready, staring at each other across the blood-soaked ground. The Eastern officer raised his sword, preparing to give the order to charge again. The Western officer did the same, his ruined face somehow conveying grim determination despite the missing flesh. This was my moment. I took a deep breath, said a prayer to a god I was not sure I believed in, and stepped out of the trees and into the clearing. The cold hit me like a physical force, and the air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood and death. The soldiers turned toward me, dozens of dead eyes fixing on the living man who had dared to enter their battlefield. For a moment, everything stopped. The entire clearing fell silent, and I could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on me like a mountain, crushing and inescapable. I stood there trembling with fear and cold and tried to find my voice. My mouth was dry. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might pass out, but I forced myself to speak. "Stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, "Stop fighting. The war is over. You can rest now." The Eastern officer, the tall one with the bayonet protruding from his stomach, took a step toward me. His boots made no sound as they touched the ground. His face was gaunt, weathered by time and death, but his eyes held a terrible awareness. His mouth moved, and this time I could hear him, though his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away, filtered through layers of time and death. "We cannot stop," he said. His voice was raw, exhausted, the voice of a man who had been speaking the same words for centuries. "We have our orders. We must hold this position until reinforcements arrive. We cannot abandon our duty." "There are no reinforcements," I said, taking a careful step forward despite every instinct screaming at me to run. "The war ended more than 150 years ago. Your duty is done. You have held your position. You can stand down now." The officer shook his head slowly, and the movement caused fresh blood to seep from the wound in his stomach, though I knew the blood was not real, just an echo of the injury that had killed him so long ago. "We cannot abandon our post. We cannot let the enemy take this ground. Too many died here. We owe it to them to keep fighting. We owe it to their memory to never surrender." I looked at the soldiers gathered around him, at their ruined bodies and empty eyes, at the wounds they had carried for lifetimes, and I understood the terrible logic that bound them here. They were not staying because they wanted to. They were staying because they believed they had to. Because they thought that if they stopped fighting, if they laid down their weapons and admitted defeat, then their deaths would have been meaningless. All the pain, all the sacrifice, all the horror they had endured would be for nothing. "Your deaths were not meaningless," I said, addressing all of them now, raising my voice so every soldier in that cursed clearing could hear me. "You were soldiers, you did your duty, you fought with honor and courage. You gave everything you had in service to something you believed in, but the fight is over. The nation you were defending still stands. Your sacrifice mattered, it made a difference. And now it is time to lay down your weapons and rest. You have earned that rest. You have earned peace." For a long moment, nothing happened. The soldiers stared at me with expressions I could not read, and I wondered if I had just made a terrible mistake. Maybe they would attack me. Maybe they would see me as an enemy, an intruder who needed to be eliminated. Maybe I would become one of them, trapped in this clearing forever, fighting battles that had ended before I was born. Then the Western officer, the one with the ruined face, lowered his sword. The weapon fell from his hand and dissolved into mist before it could hit the ground, vanishing as if it had never existed. "He is right," the Western officer said, his voice a rasping whisper that came from a throat half torn away by whatever had killed him. "I am tired, brothers. I am so very tired. I do not want to fight anymore. I do not even remember why we are fighting. I do not remember what we were supposed to accomplish. I just remember the fighting over and over forever. And I am so tired." A murmur ran through the ranks of soldiers, a sound like wind through dead leaves. One by one they began to lower their weapons. Muskets and rifles fell to the ground and dissolved. Swords and bayonets vanished into mist. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by a sound I had not heard since entering the clearing, the wind rustling through the trees, bringing with it the clean smell of the forest. The Eastern officer looked at his men, then at the Western officer, then back at me. For the first time I saw something other than determination in his eyes. I saw doubt, and beneath that doubt I saw hope. "Is it true?" he asked. Is the war really over? Did we accomplish anything? Did our deaths matter? Yes, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. The war is over. You won. All of you won because you fought for what you believed in, and your sacrifice helped build the nation that exists today. A nation that remembers its soldiers, that honors their service, that tries to be worthy of what they gave. You did your duty. You held your position. And now it is time to stand down. It is time to go home. The Eastern officer looked down at the bayonet protruding from his stomach. He reached up with one hand and grasped it, and I expected to see him grimace in pain. But instead, his face showed only relief as he pulled the weapon free. The bayonet dissolved in his hand like smoke, and the wound in his stomach sealed itself, the torn flesh knitting together until there was no sign of injury. He looked at his now whole body with wonder, then looked up at the sky where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the eastern horizon. "I had forgotten," he said softly. "I had forgotten there was anything other than fighting. I had forgotten about mourning, about peace, about rest." He turned to his men, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that transcended death, a commander's voice that had led men through countless battles. "Battalion, attention." The soldiers formed up, both groups coming together now, no longer separated by the conflicts that had defined their existence. Union and Confederate stood side by side. Revolutionary War soldiers stood with War of 1812 veterans. Even the oldest soldiers, the ones wearing uniforms I still could not identify, joined the formation. They stood at attention, straight and proud despite their wounds, looking to their officers for the final command they had been waiting more than 2 centuries to hear. "Battalion," the Eastern officer said, and his voice was strong and clear for the first time, no longer filtered through layers of death and time. "You have served with honor, courage, and dedication. You have held your position against all odds. You have done your duty, and now that duty is complete. You are released from your obligations. You are free to stand down, to lay down your arms, to find the peace that has been denied to you for so long." The change was immediate. The soldiers began to fade, their forms becoming lighter, more transparent. But their faces changed too. The blank expressions disappeared, replaced by something I can only describe as relief. Some of them were smiling. Some were crying. All of them looked peaceful, as if a terrible burden had been lifted from their shoulders. As the Eastern Battalion began to disappear, the officer turned back to me one last time. The wound on his face was healing now, the gaunt, death-haunted look fading, replaced by the face of a younger man, healthy and whole. He looked the way he must have looked before battle and death had claimed him. "Tell them we were here," he said. "Tell them we fought. Do not let us be forgotten. That is all any soldier wants, to be remembered, to know that our sacrifice meant something. Promise me you will tell our story." "I promise," I said. "I will tell everyone. You will be remembered. Your sacrifice will be honored. You will never be forgotten." He nodded once, and for the first time since I had seen him, he smiled. It was a sad smile, but a genuine one, the smile of a man who had finally been released from an unbearable burden. He brought his hand up to his forehead in a salute, holding it steady and proud. I returned the salute, though I had never been in the military and did not know if I was doing it correctly. It did not seem to matter. He held my gaze for one more moment, his eyes clear and human and grateful, then faded away like morning mist, taking his battalion with him. The Western officer was the last to go. He lingered for a moment, looking around the clearing as if seeing it for the first time without the haze of battle and death obscuring his vision. He looked at the trees, at the grass, at the stars beginning to fade as dawn approached. Then he looked up at the sky where the first rays of sunlight were painting the clouds pink and gold. "Sunrise," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder. I had forgotten how beautiful it was. I had forgotten there was anything other than darkness and fighting and death. Thank you for reminding us." Then he too was gone, dissolving into golden light that rose up toward the brightening sky and vanished, and I was alone in the clearing. The change was immediate and profound. The oppressive cold disappeared, replaced by the normal temperature of a forest morning, cool but not unnatural. Birds began to sing, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger and more confident. Insects buzzed. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of running water, a stream or creek that I had not been able to hear through the supernatural silence that had gripped the clearing. The trees no longer leaned away from the clearing but stood straight and strong. Even the grass seemed different, the strange spiral patterns fading, replaced by normal growth. The sun rose over the battlefield where so many men had fought and died and fought again, night after night, for more than 2 centuries. The light was warm and golden, and it touched everything with a gentleness that felt like a blessing, washing away the last remnants of horror and replacing them with peace. I stood there for a long time, watching the sun rise, feeling the warmth on my face, listening to the sounds of the forest coming back to life around me. I thought about duty and sacrifice, about the things that bind us to this world even after death, and about the power of words and recognition to release us from those bonds. When I finally felt capable of moving, I walked back to my campsite. I expected to find my equipment scattered or destroyed, but instead, I found that everything had been carefully gathered and placed next to my tent in neat, orderly piles. My pack was zipped closed. My camera was sitting on top of it, lens cap in place. Even my sleeping bag had been rolled up and secured with the straps, something I had not done before running into the forest. The canteen that had started everything sat on top of my pack, cleaned of dirt and gleaming in the morning light. When I picked it up, it was no longer warm. It was just metal, old and dented, but no longer carrying the weight of unfinished business. I could see the full insignia now in the sunlight. 28th Continental Regiment, encircling the eagle and shield. The Eagle Battalion. The soldiers who had vanished in 1779 and had been fighting ever since, trapped by duty and honor, and the belief that they could not stop until someone told them it was okay to rest. I spent the rest of that day documenting what I had found. I collected the artifacts scattered around the clearing, carefully cataloging each one with its GPS coordinates and a detailed description. I took dozens of photographs, and this time they came out perfectly clear, showing a peaceful meadow surrounded by healthy trees, giving no hint of the horrors it had witnessed for more than 2 centuries. I used the ground-penetrating radar again, and this time it worked flawlessly, showing clear, consistent readings with no errors or glitches. And it found graves, dozens of them, bodies buried in unmarked pits around the perimeter of the clearing, some shallow, some deep, all carefully arranged in rows that suggested someone had taken the time to give them at least a basic burial. The GPR could not tell me their names or which side they had fought for or even which war they had died in, but it gave me coordinates and depths. It gave me proof that J. Whitmore had been right. This was a battlefield, a forgotten site where men had died and been buried far from home, unmarked and unmourned, their sacrifice unrecognized for generations. But more importantly, it was now a resting place. The soldiers were finally at peace. Whatever had kept them trapped in their final moments had been broken. They were free. I spent hours walking the perimeter of the clearing, taking measurements and samples, documenting everything I could find. The temperature was normal now, varying naturally based on sun exposure and shade. My compass worked perfectly. My GPS showed my position accurately and consistently. Even my phone was working again, though the video I had tried to record the night before was completely corrupted, showing only static and distorted images that proved nothing. I found evidence of multiple battles in the clearing. The artifacts ranged from Revolutionary War-era musket balls and bayonets to Civil War mini-A balls and uniform buttons. The oldest items I found appeared to be from the 1770s, while the most recent were from 1865. More than 90 years of warfare, all concentrated in this single clearing, all the soldiers who died here somehow connected, bound together by the same curse or phenomenon that had kept the Eagle Battalion fighting for centuries. As I worked, I kept thinking about what the Eastern officer had said. Tell them we were here. Tell them we fought. Do not let us be forgotten. That is what they had wanted more than anything. Not revenge. Not to harm the living. Not to spread their curse to others. They just wanted to be remembered. They wanted their sacrifice to be acknowledged. They wanted to know that their deaths had mattered. And I realized that this was what kept so many spirits trapped in our world. Not evil or malice or unfinished business in the dramatic sense, but simply the need to be recognized, to be remembered, to know that they had existed and that their lives had meant something. We spend so much time thinking of ghosts as monsters or threats when maybe they are just lost souls who need someone to say, "I see you. I remember you. Your life mattered." I packed up my equipment late that afternoon and prepared for the hike back to my truck. Before I left, I stood in the center of the clearing one more time and spoke to the silence. "Rest well, soldiers. Your watch is ended. You held your position with honor and now you can finally go home. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. You will not be forgotten." The wind rustled through the trees, and I could have sworn I heard voices in it, distant and faint but filled with gratitude. Then the wind died down, and there was only the peaceful silence of a forest at rest. I hiked back to my truck as the sun was setting, the forest no longer frightening but simply beautiful, the way wilderness is supposed to be. The hike that had taken me 3 hours the day before took less than 2 hours going back. The temperature was comfortable. My equipment worked perfectly, and I felt lighter somehow, as if I had been carrying a burden I had not known about and had finally been able to set it down. I drove straight to Patricia's office, arriving just as she was preparing to leave for the day. When she saw me walk in, still covered in dirt and leaves from the forest, she looked relieved and concerned in equal measure. "Austin, thank God. I was starting to worry. You look exhausted." "I am," I said, sinking into the chair across from her desk. "But I found it, the battlefield. It is real. Everything Whitmore said was true." I gave her my report, showed her my photographs and data, described the artifacts I had collected, and the graves I had located. I told her about the Revolutionary War insignia on the canteen and my theory that the site was originally where the Eagle Battalion had died, with later battles from the Civil War somehow connected to the same location. I told her everything except the part about the ghosts. Some things sound too impossible to be believed, even when they are true. And besides, the important part was not that the soldiers had been haunted. The important part was that they were free now, and that their graves had been found and could finally be honored. Patricia listened to my report without interrupting, taking notes and studying the photographs I had printed out. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is significant," she finally said. "Very significant. The Eagle Battalion has been a mystery for more than 2 centuries. Historians have speculated about what happened to them, but there has never been any physical evidence. If you have really found their final resting place, this could rewrite part of Revolutionary War history." "I believe I have," I said. "The insignia on the canteen matches their regimental symbol. The location fits with where they were last reported on patrol, and the number of graves matches roughly with the size of their battalion." "We will need to excavate," Patricia said, already making notes. "We will need archaeologists, historians, possibly military historians who specialize in the Revolutionary War period. This will take time and funding, but it needs to be done properly. These men deserve to be honored." She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I had not expected. She knew. She had not asked me about the phenomena Whitmore had described in his letters, had not questioned why I looked so shaken despite my professional report. She knew something had happened to me in that clearing, something I was not saying, and she was letting me keep my silence out of kindness or understanding, or perhaps her own experience with places that did not follow natural laws. "Take a few days off," she said gently. "You have earned it. I will start making calls and putting together a team. When you come back, we will return to the site together and begin the official documentation." I thanked her and left, driving home through the darkness with the canteen sitting on the passenger seat next to me. I should have turned it in as evidence, but I could not bring myself to let it go. It felt like a sacred trust, a reminder of the promise I had made. Over the next 2 months, I threw myself into research. I needed to understand what I had witnessed, needed to find some explanation that made sense of the impossible things I had seen. I spent hours in archives and libraries, digging through Revolutionary War records, looking for any mention of the Eagle Battalion. I found their formation records at the Library of Congress. The 28th Continental Regiment, raised in Virginia in June 1778, commanded by Colonel Michael Crawford, composed of 183 officers and men. They had fought in several engagements in Pennsylvania and New Jersey before being reassigned to the Shenandoah Valley in early 1779 to protect supply routes and settlements from British raiders. The last official mention of them was dated September 3, 1779, a report from Colonel Crawford stating that his battalion was proceeding to investigate reports of enemy activity near the headwaters of the South Fork of the Shenandoah River. They were expected to return within 2 weeks. They never returned. Search parties found no trace of them, no bodies, no equipment, no signs of battle. It was as if the entire battalion had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The Continental Army listed them as missing and presumed dead, and their families received condolences but no answers and no closure. But I had found those answers. I knew what had happened to them. They had been ambushed in that clearing, attacked by a force they could not defeat, probably British regulars supported by Native American warriors who knew the terrain. They had fought desperately, trying to hold the position until reinforcements could arrive, but the reinforcements never came. They died to the last man, following their orders to hold the ground no matter the cost. And somehow, that dedication, that absolute commitment to duty, had bound them to the clearing. They had died believing they needed to hold the position, and so they continued holding it, night after night, century after century, unable to rest because no one had ever told them their mission was complete. But why had other soldiers joined them? Why had Civil War soldiers, who died nearly a century later, been caught in the same trap? I found the answer in local records at the Front Royal Historical Society. During the Civil War, the same clearing had been the site of multiple skirmishes between Union and Confederate forces. The area had changed hands several times, and both sides had fought battles there, trying to control the high ground that overlooked the valley. But there was something else, something the official records did not mention, but that showed up in soldiers' letters and diaries that had been preserved by local families. Multiple soldiers from both sides mentioned that the clearing felt wrong. They reported strange phenomena, temperature drops, malfunctioning equipment, feelings of being watched, and most tellingly, several soldiers reported seeing ghostly figures in Revolutionary War uniforms marching through the clearing at night. Most of the officers dismissed these reports as superstition or battle fatigue, but the soldiers knew what they had seen, and when they died in that clearing, they became part of the phenomenon, trapped by the same force that had trapped the Eagle Battalion. It was not a curse in the traditional sense. It was more like a scar in reality, a place where the barrier between life and death had been damaged by violence and trauma. The Eagle Battalion had created that scar when they died refusing to abandon their post, and every soldier who died there afterward had been pulled into the same loop, forced to fight the same eternal battle, all of them bound together by duty and death, and the terrible conviction that they could not rest until their mission was complete. Patricia approved the designation, and within a month, the clearing in the Shenandoah Valley was officially recognized as a significant historical site, the final resting place of the Eagle Battalion and the site of multiple Civil War engagements. The graves were excavated by a team of archaeologists under Patricia's supervision, and I assisted with the documentation. The excavation took weeks. We found the remains of 178 individuals in the grave sites around the clearing. Some were clearly from the Revolutionary War period based on the artifacts buried with them. Continental Army buttons, Revolutionary War musket parts, and personal items like pocket watches and coins dated to the 1770s. Others were from the Civil War, both Union and Confederate soldiers buried in separate areas, but all within the same cursed ground. Each set of remains was treated with the utmost respect. The archaeologists worked slowly and carefully, documenting everything, preserving every artifact, ensuring that these men who had been forgotten for so long would finally be properly honored. The remains were reinterred with full military honors in a national cemetery, about 30 miles from the original site. The ceremony was attended by representatives from the Army, historians, local officials, and descendants of some of the Revolutionary War soldiers who had managed to trace their family trees back to men who had served in the Eagle Battalion. I attended the ceremony, standing in the back while a military chaplain said prayers over the coffins, and an honor guard fired a 21-gun salute that echoed across the cemetery. Each soldier received a proper headstone. Most of them were marked Unknown Continental Soldier, or Unknown Union Soldier, or Unknown Confederate Soldier, but a few were identified through forensic analysis and historical records, and those stones bore names: Private Thomas Ashford, Continental Army; Corporal William Hayes, Union Army; Lieutenant James Morrison, Confederate States Army. They were no longer forgotten. They were no longer lost. They had finally come home. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, an elderly woman approached me. She was in her 80s, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "You are the one who found them," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I am Austin. I am the researcher who documented the site." She studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than I wanted to reveal. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore. Jay Whitmore was my uncle. He spent the last 20 years of his life trying to get someone to listen to him about that clearing. He died believing no one cared." "I am so sorry," I said. "I wish I had found his letters sooner. I wish I could have told him that he was right, that his efforts mattered." She shook her head. "You did something better. You gave those men peace. My uncle would have wanted that more than anything." She reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph. The black and white image faded with age. "This is my great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Whitmore. He was a private in the Eagle Battalion. He died in that clearing in 1779. My family has known about it for generations, passed the story down from parent to child, but we could never prove it. We could never convince anyone to look for him." The photograph showed a young man in a Continental Army uniform, his face serious and dignified. He looked like he could have been 20 years old or 30. It was hard to tell from the faded image, but his eyes held a determination that I recognized. I had seen that same determination in the Eastern officer's face right before he faded into the dawn. "He is at rest now," I said, and I meant it. "They all are. They held their position for more than 2 centuries, and now they finally have permission to stand down. Your great-great-great-grandfather was a good soldier. He did his duty, and now he can rest." Eleanor Whitmore smiled, and tears ran down her weathered cheeks. "Thank you," she said simply. Then she pressed the photograph into my hands. "Keep this. Remember him. That is all we can do for the dead. Remember them and tell their stories." I kept the photograph. I keep it still, in a frame on my desk next to the canteen from the Eagle Battalion. They remind me every day of why I do this work, why it matters to document the forgotten places and honor the people who died there. After the ceremony, Patricia and I worked with the National Park Service to install a memorial at the site. It took several months to get approval and funding, but finally, one crisp morning in early spring, we dedicated a simple stone marker in the clearing. The marker is made of granite, about 5 feet tall, with inscriptions on all 4 sides. The front bears the insignia of the Eagle Battalion and reads, "Here fought the 28th Continental Regiment, known as the Eagle Battalion, who vanished on patrol September 1779. Their watch has ended." The other 3 sides list the names of every soldier we were able to identify, both Revolutionary War and Civil War, along with the words, "They rest now in honored peace." I visit the site sometimes, usually in the early morning or late evening when the light is soft and the forest is quiet. The clearing is peaceful now, truly peaceful in a way it was not before. Wildflowers grow there in the spring, and deer come to graze in the early mornings. Birds nest in the surrounding trees. The grass grows in normal patterns and the trees stand straight and healthy. There are no cold spots, no malfunctioning equipment, no sense of being watched by unseen eyes. It is just a clearing in the woods, beautiful and serene, giving no hint of the centuries of torment it once contained. But I always bring the canteen with me when I visit. It is mine now, I suppose, a reminder of the night I learned that death is not always the end, and duty does not always end with dying. Sometimes the dead need help letting go. Sometimes they need someone to bear witness to their sacrifice and give them permission to finally rest. That is the story of the battalion that fought until sunrise, long after they died. I told you at the beginning that I used to believe only in facts, in things that could be proven and documented. I still believe in facts, but I also believe in things that cannot be easily explained, in phenomena that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The rational part of my brain still tries to find explanations for what I experienced. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was isolation, maybe there is some scientific phenomenon we do not yet understand that can explain ghostly soldiers and eternal battles. But in my heart, I know what I saw was real. I know those men were trapped, and I know I helped free them. And that knowledge has changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. I approach my work differently now. When I visit a battlefield or a forgotten grave site, I do not just document the physical evidence. I listen. I pay attention to the feeling of a place, to the sense of whether something is at peace or still restless. And sometimes when I stand in a place where violence has occurred, where people have died traumatically or unfairly, I speak to the silence. I tell them they are remembered. I tell them their sacrifice mattered. I tell them it is okay to rest now, that their watch has ended, that they can finally lay down their burdens and find peace. Sometimes I think I hear them answer, a whisper on the wind, a sense of gratitude in the air, a sudden warming of a cold spot, and then the phenomena cease and another piece of land returns to peace. I cannot prove this happens. I have no scientific evidence, no recordings or measurements that would convince a skeptic. But I know it is real, just as surely as I know the sun will rise tomorrow. And if you are watching this, if this story has resonated with you, then I ask you to do something for me. Share this video. Not for me, but for the soldiers who can finally rest. Their story deserves to be told. They deserve to be remembered. And maybe, just maybe, there are other places out there where the dead are still fighting, still waiting for someone to tell them their watch has ended. Hit that like button if you believe there are more to some places than we can see with our eyes alone. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about the unexplained, the forgotten, and the impossible things that turn out to be true when you are brave enough to face them. And leave a comment telling me about any experiences you have had with places that felt wrong, with histories that refused to stay buried, with moments when the past reached out and touched you in ways you could not explain. I read every comment, and your stories matter. They matter because they remind us that we are not alone in experiencing things that defy easy explanation. As for me, I am still out there, still documenting forgotten battlefields and unmarked graves, still bringing light to the dark corners of history that have been overlooked or deliberately hidden. But now I approach my work with a deeper understanding of what it means to be a researcher of the past. I am not just documenting facts and dates. I am bearing witness to lives lived and sacrifices made. I am giving voice to people who can no longer speak for themselves. And sometimes, I am helping lost souls find their way home. The battalion fought until sunrise, but the sunrise finally came. And in its light, they were able to lay down their weapons and find the rest they had earned so many lifetimes ago. 3 weeks after the memorial dedication, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, and the postmark was smudged and illegible. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. "Thank you for keeping your promise. We are home now. Tell others who are lost that it is okay to rest. There are more who wait. Colonel M. Crawford, 28th Continental Regiment." I should have been terrified. I should have thought it was a hoax or a cruel joke. But the handwriting looked old, faded, as if the ink had been drying for centuries. And when I held the paper up to the light, I could see a watermark, a shield with the number 28 and an eagle above it. I keep that letter in a safe place, along with the canteen and the photograph of Thomas Whitmore. They are evidence of something that cannot be proven, but that I know in my bones is true. Death is not always the end, and sometimes the living have a responsibility to help the dead find peace. Since that night in the clearing, I have visited dozens of other sites. Some of them felt normal, just places where history happened long ago. But others felt wrong in the same way the Eagle Battalion's clearing had felt wrong. Cold spots, equipment failures, an oppressive sense of being watched. At each of those sites, I spoke to the silence. I told whatever spirits might be there that they were remembered, that their sacrifice mattered, that they could rest now. And at each site, the phenomena gradually faded. The cold spots warmed. The equipment started working. The oppressive feeling lifted. I cannot prove that my words made a difference, but I choose to believe they did. I choose to believe that recognition and respect and permission can break even the strongest bonds between the living world and the dead. I have started keeping a journal of these experiences, documenting not just the historical facts but the phenomena I encounter and what happens when I address them directly. Maybe someday I will publish it. Maybe I will find others who have had similar experiences and we can compare notes, develop theories, try to understand the mechanisms behind these hauntings. Or maybe I will keep it private, a record for my own understanding, proof to myself that I am not losing my mind, that what I experienced in that clearing was real, and that the work I am doing matters. Either way, I will continue doing this work. I will continue seeking out the forgotten places and the forgotten people. I will continue bearing witness to their stories and helping them find peace when I can. Because that is what the Eastern officer asked me to do. Tell them we were here, tell them we fought. Do not let us be forgotten. I kept my promise to him, and I will keep making that same promise to every soldier, every victim, every lost soul I encounter in my work. I am Austin. I am 27 years old, and I am one of the few people alive who can say with certainty that ghosts are real, that duty extends beyond the grave, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do for the dead is simply to remember them and give them permission to rest. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for watching until the end. Thank you for helping me keep my promise to soldiers who waited more than 2 centuries to be remembered and honored. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the relationship between the living and the dead, about duty and sacrifice, and the things that bind us to this world even after we should have moved on, then please share it with others. These stories need to be told. These experiences need to be discussed. We need to stop pretending that the world is only what we can see and measure, and start acknowledging that there are mysteries all around us, phenomena we do not yet understand, and responsibilities we have to those who came before us. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never forget. The past is never as dead as we think it is. The dead are not as gone as we would like to believe. And sometimes the greatest service we can perform is to bear witness to those who can no longer speak for themselves and tell them, with all the authority we can muster, that their watch has ended and they can finally rest. The Eagle Battalion held their position for 246 years. But on that October night when I stepped into their clearing and told them they could stand down, they finally completed their mission. They finally came home. And now, whenever I visit that peaceful clearing in the Shenandoah Valley, whenever I stand in that place where so much pain and death and stubborn courage once held sway, I feel only peace. The birds sing, the deer graze, the wildflowers bloom in their season. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees, I think I hear a sound like distant music, like a fife and drum corps playing a marching tune from another century, fading slowly into silence as the soldiers who played it march away into whatever comes after death. They are home now. They are finally truly home, and I carry their story with me wherever I go, a reminder that duty and honor and sacrifice are not just words but forces powerful enough to transcend death itself, and that sometimes all it takes to break those bonds is for someone to say, "Your duty is complete. You have done enough. You can rest now." That is the promise I made to the Eagle Battalion on that October night when the world balanced on the edge between darkness and dawn. That is the promise I will continue to make to every lost soul I encounter in my work. And that is the promise I make to you, whoever is watching this. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, in a place where the past seems to press against the present, where the dead seem unable to rest, remember what I learned in that clearing. Speak to them. Acknowledge their sacrifice. Tell them they are remembered. Tell them their watch has ended. Tell them they can finally go home. You might be surprised at what happens when you do. The world is full of forgotten places and forgotten people, all of them waiting for someone to remember, to bear witness, to give them permission to let go of what binds them to this world. We can be those people. We can be the ones who help the dead find peace. It is a responsibility, yes, but it is also a privilege. To stand in a place where history happened and to speak directly to those who made that history, to honor their sacrifice and help them find release from their burdens, that is work that matters. That is work that changes not just the dead but the living as well. I am changed by what happened in that clearing. I see the world differently now. I understand that history is not just something that happened in the past, but something that continues to affect the present in ways we rarely acknowledge. And I know that my work is not just about documenting facts, but about bearing witness to lives lived and helping souls find rest. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to a story that many people would dismiss as impossible or insane. Thank you for being open to the possibility that the world contains mysteries we do not yet understand, and that our relationship with death and the dead is more complex than we have been taught to believe. Remember the Eagle Battalion. Remember the men who fought in that clearing, who gave everything in service to something they believed in, who held their position with honor and courage for more than 2 centuries. They are at peace now, but their story lives on. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their stories and honor their sacrifice, they will never truly be gone. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the past is always with us. The dead are never truly gone, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply to remember and to bear witness. The battalion fought until sunrise long after they died, but the sunrise finally came. And in its light they found their way home. Rest in peace, Eagle Battalion. Your watch has ended. You have done your duty, and you will never ever be forgotten.